Chapter 9 Concepcion and Misconception. Although our sojourn on the Saskatchewan plains satisfied my father in most respects, he nevertheless knew one hunger that the West could not still. Before coming to Saskatoon, he had always lived close by the open waters of the Great Lakes and had been a sailor on them since his earliest days. Nor is this purely a figurative statement, for by his own account he was conceived in the placid waters of the Bay of Quinte in a green canoe. He came by his passion for the water honestly. During his first year in Saskatoon, he was able to stifle his nautical cravings beneath the weight of many new experiences the Wait had to offer him. But during the long winter of the second prairie year, he began to dream. When he sat down to dinner of an evening, he would be with mother and myself in the flesh only, for in spirit he was dining on hardtack and salt beef on one of Nelson's ships. He took to carrying a piece of marlin in his pockets, and visitors to his office in the library would watch curiously as he tied and untied a variety of sailor's knots while talking in an abstracted voice about the problems of book distribution in prairie towns. Knowing my father, and knowing too that he was not the kind to remain satisfied with the dream world, it came as no surprise to mother and me when he announced that he intended to buy a ship, and prove that a sailor can find fulfillment even on the drought-stricken western plains. I was skeptical. Only the previous summer, we had made a journey to Regina, the capital of the province, where I had spent some hours on the banks of the Wascana Lake. Wascana was made by men, not God, and by just such men as my father. It boasted 2 yacht clubs and a fleet of 12 sailing craft, but it could boast of no water at all. I have never seen anything as pitiful as those little vessels sitting forlornly on the sun-cracked mud of the lake bottom, their seams gaping in the summer heat. I remember Wascana when father told us his plans, and supposing that he must remember the Phantom Lake as well, I asked him if he was contemplating dryland sailing, on wheels perhaps. I was sent to bed early and without my supper, and I felt a little hurt, for I had only been trying to help. He bought his ship a few weeks later. She was a 16-foot sailing canoe that by some mischance had drifted into the arid heart of Saskatchewan. Berthed temporarily in our basement, she looked small and fragile, but she was to prove herself a stout little vessel indeed. And in this year of 1957, she remains very much alive, still pert and active, and she and I still sail together every summer. My father spent the balance of the winter laboring over her. With meticulous and loving care, he built lee boards, splashboards, a mast, a steering oar, and a set of paddles. He borrowed mother's sewing machine and made a sail out of the finest Egyptian cotton, shipped to him from Montreal. As for the canoe herself, he burnished her sides with steel wool, scraped them with glass, and painted and repainted until her flanks were as smooth as the surface of a mirror. Then he applied the final coat of paint, bright green, and with some ceremony christened her Concepcion. He said that she was so named after an island in the Philippines. Her launching took place on a day in early May. I helped father carry her down to the riverbank beside the 25th Street Bridge, and en route we collected an interested group of followers. Vessels of any sort had been unknown in Saskatoon since the time of the prairie schooners, and Concepcion was an eye-catching maiden in her own right. As my father went about the task of stepping the mast and preparing the canoe for her first voyage, the crowd of onlookers increased steadily in numbers. High above our heads, the ramparts of the bridge darkened with a frieze of spectators. They were all very quiet and very solemn as my father nodded his head to tell me he was ready, and then I pushed Concepcion into her own element. It was early spring, and the Saskatchewan River was still in flood. My father knew all that there was to know about water, so he believed, and it had not occurred to him that there would be much difference between the Bay of Quinte and the South Saskatchewan. There was a good breeze blowing, and it riffled the surging brown surface of the water, effectively concealing the telltale swirls and vortexes beneath. The watchers on the bridge, on the other hand, knew a good deal about the nature of prairie rivers in the spring, and there may have been something funereal about the hush that lay upon them as they watched father and Concepcion take to the stream. The launching took place several hundred feet above the bridge, but by the time father had everything ship-shape and was able to look his eyes about, the bridge had inexplicably changed its position in relation to him. It was now several hundred yards behind him and receding at a positively terrifying rate of speed. He became extremely active. He ran up the sail and began hauling in the sheet in an effort to come about. From the parapets, where I now stood watching with the rest, there came a gasp of mingled awe and admiration. Most of the watchers had never seen a sailing vessel before, and they had always understood the sail was old-fashioned and painfully slow way of getting about. Their eyes were being opened. Concepcion was acting strangely. She would not come about, for the current was stronger than the breeze. She resolutely skittered downstream, making about 12 knots. She should have been making about 5 in the light air. My father knew it. He began to understand about the current. He got out his paddle with an almost demoniac frenzy, strove to bring her to head upstream. He was successful in the end, but by that time he and Concepcion were no more than a rapidly diminishing dot upon the distant surface of the water. Some of the men standing on the bridge beside me began making bets as to when father would reach the town of Prince Albert, some hundreds of miles downstream. But it was clear that my father did not really want to reach Prince Albert. He was sailing the canoe now with a grim determination and a skill that he had probably never been called upon before to use. He wanted very badly to come back to Saskatoon. Concepcion beat back and forth across the river like a woodchip on a frothing mill race. She tacked and beat, and though she kept her head resolutely upstream, and though she was sailing like a witch, she nevertheless kept diminishing in her view until at last she vanished altogether in the bright distance to the north. One of the men near me glanced at his watch and spoke to his companion. 11 o'clock. Of course, he'll be a mite slower now going backward that way, but he'll hit the Prince Albert Bridge by supper time. I'll lay you 50 cents he does. He would have lost his bet, however, for father and Concepcion did not go to Prince Albert after all. They might have done so had they not been fortunate enough to run aground some 10 miles below Saskatoon. Shortly after midnight, they arrived home together in a farm cart that was being towed by 2 non-committal horses. The setback to my father's design was only temporary. Never mind, he said at breakfast the next day. We'll wait till the spring flood passes, and then we'll see. But what we saw when the flood was gone was not encouraging. The South Saskatchewan was back to normal, and normal consisted of a desert expanse of mud bars with here and there an expiring pool of trapped brown scum, and in a very few favoured places, a sluggish trickle of moving water. It was a sight that would have discouraged any man except my father. He refused to be defeated. He had made his plans that the river would simply have to conform to them. That was the way he was. His plan suited me well enough, for we closed up our rented house and moved our old caravan some 10 miles south of the city to the Saskatoon Golf and Country Club. Here on the wooded banks of the Saskatchewan we established our summer residence. It was a fine place for a boy to spend a summer. There were enough pools remaining in the riverbed to provide swimming of a sort. There was a stretch of virgin prairie where coyotes denned and where determined gentlemen batted golf balls into gopher holes. And only a few miles away there was a reservation. My time was now my own, for the summer holidays had begun, but my father had to commute to work in the city every day. Might have done so by car, but he had planned to commute by water, and he refused to be dissuaded in the uncooperativeness of nature. At 7 o'clock on the first Monday morning, he and Concepcion set out bravely and full of confidence in one another. But when they returned late that evening, it was as passengers in and on a friend's automobile. My father was very weary and very uncommunicative about the day's misadventures. It was not until years later that he admitted to me he had actually walked 8 of the 10 miles to Saskatoon, towing Concepcion behind him through the shallows or carrying her on his shoulders across sandbars. There had been a brief but exciting interlude with one sandbar that turned out to be quicksand too, but on this he would not dwell. Through the next few days he wisely but reluctantly commuted in Erdley, but then there was a rainfall somewhere to the south and the river rose a few inches. Erdley was again abandoned, and Concepcion returned to a place of favour. During the weeks that followed, she and father became intimately familiar with the multitudes of sandbars, the quicksands of the other mysteries of the shrunken river's channels. And to the astonishment of all observers, my father began to make a success of his water route to the office. It was true that he still walked almost as far as he was able to paddle, but at least he was spared the ignominy of having to haul the canoe along in front of an audience, for a relatively deep channel running through the city enabled him to paddle the final mile of his route to the landing place near the Best Barrow Hotel with Hiawathan dignity. He would not leave the Concepcion on the riverbank to await his return, but carried her with him right to the library building. The first few times that he came tottering through the morning traffic in the city centre with the green canoe balanced gracefully on his shoulders, he caused some comment among the passer-bys. But after a week or two, people ceased to stare at him, and no one, with the exception of a few ultra-conservative ice-wagon horses, so much as gave him a second glance. He and Concepcion had become an unremarked part of the local scene. Mutt often accompanied father and Concepcion downriver. He quickly developed the requisite sense of balance and would stand at the bow, his paws on the narrow foredeck, poised like a canine gargoyle. This was not mere posturing on his part either, for he had taken it on himself to give warning when the canoe approached shallow water or hidden bar. His proficiency as a pilot was not high, despite his good intentions, for he was notoriously short-sighted, nor could he, as they say, read water. After a hysterical outburst prompted by a current boil that he mistaken for a submerged lodge, he would very likely be staring placidly into space when Concepcion ran hard aground. If the canoe was traveling at any speed, Mutt would be catapulted overboard to land on his face in the muddy water. He took such mishaps in good part, and would return to his piloting duties with increased vigilance. Father was able to paddle Concepcion, more or less, on the river, but that mean-natured trickle gave him no opportunity to sail. Since it was sailing he really craved, he was forced to look for other waters, and one weekend he announced that we would visit Manitou Lake, a vast saline slough that lies some 100 miles from Saskatoon. Manitou is one of the saltiest bodies of water in the world, and Concepcion was not designed to float on a medium that was hardly more fluid than molasses. She would have no part of Manitou. When we launched her, she hardly wet her keel, but sat on the surface of the lake like a duck upon a slab of ice. My father was annoyed by her behavior and set about forcing his will upon her by loading her with rocks. It took an unbelievable number of boulders to force her down to her marks, and when Father and I finally clambered aboard, it was to find her about as unmaneuverable as a concrete coffin floating in gelatin. The water in which she stuck was so thick with salt that I could almost hear the stuff rasping on her sleek sides. And when we hoisted sail, the wind had little effect upon her as it would have been upon the Carnegie-built walls of the Saskatoon Public Library itself. My father was infuriated by Concepcion's lack of response, and unwisely began to jettison the ballast. He heaved 6 large boulders overside when the canoe decided she had enough. One gunwale rose buoyantly while the other sank, and in short seconds we were floating on a serene sea, while below us Concepcion was slowly dragged toward the bottom by her belly full of stone. We were in no danger. It was physically impossible for an unweighted human body to sink in Manitou Lake. On the contrary, we rode so high out of the water that we had trouble navigating to the nearby shore. And when it came to salvaging Concepcion, who lay in some 10 feet of water, the unnatural qualities of Manitou posed a serious problem. We found that we simply could not dive. It was a most eerie experience, for we could not force ourselves more than a foot below the surface. In the end, Father had to weight himself, like a South Sea pearl diver, with a basket full of stones. Clinging to this with one hand, he managed to reach the sunken ship and fasten a line to the thwart. Then he rather thoughtlessly let go of the basket. He came up from the depths like a playful salmon leaping after a fly, shot half out of the water, and fell back with a resounding thwack that must have hurt him almost as much as had Concepcion's behavior. But in the end, the frustrations which beset my father's desire to sail again were no match for his perseverance. In August of that memorable year, we hitched the caravan to Erdley, placed Concepcion on the roof, and went off on a dogged search for sailing waters. And we found them. Far to the north, in the Jackpine country beyond Prince Albert, we came to a place called Emma Lake, and it was an honest lake, filled with honest water, and caressed by amiable winds. We launched Concepcion with trepidation, for there had been many unfortunate episodes in the past. Then we climbed aboard and hoisted sail. It was the kind of day that graces the western plains, and only them. The sky was crystalline and limitless, and the hard sun cut the surface of the lake into a myriad of brilliant shards. Flocks of black terns swirled on the westerly breeze that came down on us from the pine forest and gently filled Concepcion's sail, bellowing it into a curve as beautiful as any wing. She came alive. We sailed that day, all of it, until the sun went sickly behind the blue shield of smoke from distant forest fires and sank away, taking the breeze with it. And we sailed aboard a little ship whose swift and delicate motion was more than sufficient reward for the rebuffs we had suffered.